The answer to the question of the who of everyday Dasein is to be won through the analysis of the kind of being in which Dasein, initially and for the most part, maintains itself. Our investigation takes its orientation from being in the world. This fundamental constitution of Dasein co-determines every mode of its being. If we justifiably stated that all other structural factors of being in the world already came into view by means of the previous explication of the world, then the answer to the question of the who must also be prepared by that explication. The description of the surrounding world closest to us, for example, the work world of the handworker, showed that together with the useful things found in work, others are also encountered for whom the work is to be done. In the kind of being of these things at hand, that is, in their relevance, there lies an essential reference to possible wearers for whom they should be made to measure. Similarly, the producer or supplier is encountered in the material used as one who serves well or badly. The field, for example, along which we walk outside, shows itself as belonging to such and such a person who keeps it in good order. The book which we use is bought at such and such a place, given by such and such a person, and so on. The boat anchored at the shore refers in its being in itself to an acquaintance who undertakes his voyages with it, but even as a boat which is unknown to us, it still points to other. The others who are encountered in the context of useful things in the surrounding world at hand are not somehow added on in thought to an initially merely objectively present thing, but these things are encountered from the world in which they are at hand for the others. This world is always already from the outset my own. In our previous analysis, the scope of what is encountered in the world was initially narrowed down to useful things at hand, or nature objectively present, thus to beings of a character unlike Dasein. This restriction was not only necessary for the purpose of simplifying the explication, but, above all, because the kind of being of the existence of others encountered within the surrounding world is distinct from handiness and objective present. The world of Dasein thus frees beings which are not only completely different from tools and things, but which themselves in accordance with their kind of being, as Dasein are themselves, in the world as being enthralled in which they are at the same time encountered. These beings are neither objectively present nor at hand, but they are like the very Dasein which frees them. They are there too and there with it. So, if one wanted to identify the world in general with inner-worldly beings, one would have to say the world is also Dasein. But the characteristic of encountering others is, after all, oriented toward one's own Dasein. Does not it, too, start with the distinction and isolation of the I, so that a transition from this isolated subject to others must then be sought? In order to avoid this misunderstanding, we must observe in what sense we are talking about other. Others does not mean everybody else but me, those from whom the I distinguishes itself. Others are, rather, those from whom one mostly does not distinguish oneself, those among whom one also is. This being there too with them does not have the ontological character of being objectively present with them within a world. The with is of the character of Dasein. The also means the sameness of being sane as circumspect, heedful being in the world. With and also are to be understood existentially, not categorially. On the basis of this with bound myth and being in the world is always already the one that I share with others. The world of Dasein is a with world mitwelt. Being in is being with mitseen others. The inner-worldly being in itself of others is Dasein with mitdasein. Others are not encountered by grasping and discriminating beforehand one's own subject, initially objectively present, from other subjects also present. They are not encountered by first looking at oneself, and then ascertaining the opposite pole of a distinction. They are encountered from out of the world in which Dasein, heedful and circumspect, essentially dwell. As opposed to the theoretically concocted explanations of the presence of others, which easily urge themselves upon us, we must hold fast to the phenomenal fact which we have pointed out, namely, that they are encountered in the surrounding world. This nearest and elemental way of Dasein encountering the world goes so far that even one's own Dasein initially becomes discoverable by looking away from its experiences and the center of its actions, or by not yet seeing them at all. Dasein initially finds itself in what it does, needs, expects, has charge of, in the things at hand which it initially takes care of in the surrounding world. And even when Dasein explicitly addresses itself as I here, the locative personal designation must be understood in terms of the existential spatiality of Dasein. When we interpreted this, section 23, we already intimated that this I here does not refer to an eminent point of an I thing, rather, it understands itself, as being in terms of the over there of the world at hand, where Dasein dwells in taking care. W. V. Humboldt has alluded to certain languages which express the I by here, the thou by there, and the he by over there, thus rendering the personal pronouns by locative adverbs, to put it grammatically. It is disputed whether the primordial meaning of locative expressions is adverbial or pronominal. This dispute loses its basis if one notes that locative adverbs have a relation to the I qua Dasein. Here, over there, and there are not primarily pure locative designations of inner-worldly beings objectively present at positions in space, but rather characteristics of the primordial spatiality of Dasein. Supposedly locative adverbs are determinations of Dasein. They have primarily an existential, not a categorical meaning. But they are not pronouns either. Their significance is prior to the distinction of locative adverb and personal pronoun. The true spatial meaning of these expressions of Dasein, however, documents the fact that the theoretically undistorted interpretation of Dasein sees the latter immediately in its spatial being together with, sein by the world taken care of, spatial in the sense of de-distancing and directionality. In the here, Dasein, absorbed in its world, does not address itself, but speaks away from itself, in circumspection to the over there of something at hand and means, however, itself in its existential spatiality. Dasein understands itself, initially and for the most part, in terms of its world, and the Dasein-with of others is frequently encountered from inner-worldly things at hand. But when others become, so to speak, thematic in their Dasein, they are not encountered as objectively present thing-persons, rather we meet them at work, that is, primarily in their being in the world. Even when we see the other, just standing around, he is never understood as a human thing objectively present. Standing around is an existential mode of being, the lingering with everything and nothing which lacks heedfulness and circumspection. The other is encountered in his Dasein within the world. But after all, the expression Dasein clearly shows that this being seiend is initially unrelated to others, that it can, of course, also be with others subsequently. But we must not overlook the fact that we are also using the term Dasein-with as a designation of the being to which the existing others are freed within the world. The Dasein-with of others is disclosed only within the world, and so too for beings who are Daseins with us, because Dasein in itself is essentially being with. The phenomenological statement that Dasein is essentially being with has an existential ontological meaning. It does not intend to ascertain ontically that I am factically not objectively present alone, rather that others of my kind also are vorcum. If the statement that the being in the world of Dasein is essentially constituted by being with meant something like this, being with would not be an existential attribute that belongs to Dasein of itself on the basis of its kind of being, but something which occurs at times on the basis of the existence of other. Being with existentially determines Dasein even when an other is not factically present and perceived. The being alone of Dasein, too, is being within the world. The other can be lacking only in and for a being with. Being alone is a deficient mode of being with. Its possibility is a proof for the latter. On the other hand, factical being alone is not changed by the fact that a second instance of a human being is next to me, or by 10 such human beings. Even when these and still more are present, Dasein can be alone. Thus, being with and the facticity of being with one another are not based on the fact that several subjects are physically there together. Being alone, among many, however, does not mean with respect to the being of others that they are simply objectively present. Even in being among them, they are there with mit-da. Their Dasein-with is encountered in the mode of indifference and being alien. Lacking and being away are modes of Dasein-with and are possible only because Dasein as being with lets the Dasein of others be encountered in its world. Being with is an attribute of one's own Dasein. Dasein-with characterizes the Dasein of others in that it is freed for a being with mitzin by the world of that being with. Only because it has the essential structure of being with is one's own Dasein encounterable by others as Dasein. If being with remains existentially constitutive for being enthralled, it must be interpreted, as must also circumspect dealings with the inner-worldly things at hand, which we characterized by way of anticipation as taking care besorgen, in terms of the phenomenon of Kehrsorge which we used to designate the being of Dasein in general. Cf. Chapter 6 of this division. Taking care of things is a character of being which being with cannot have as its own, although this kind of being is a being towards sein zu beings encountered in the world, as is taking care of things. The being Cn to which Dasein is related as being with does not, however, have the kind of being of useful things at hand. It is itself Dasein. This being is not taken care of, but is a matter of concern forsooth. Even taking care of food and clothing, and the nursing of the sick body is concern. But we understand this expression in a way which corresponds to our use of taking care, as a term for an existential. For example, welfare work Fursorge, as a factical social institution, is based on the constitution of being of Dasein as being with. Its factical urgency is motivated by the fact that Dasein initially, and for the most part, lives in the deficient modes of concern. Being for, against, and without one another, passing one another by, not mattering to one another, are possible ways of concern. And precisely the last named modes of deficiency and indifference characterize the everyday and average being with one another. These modes of being show the characteristics of inconspicuousness and obviousness which belong to everyday inner-worldly Dasein-with of others, as well as to the handiness of useful things taken care of daily. These indifferent modes of being with one another tend to mislead the ontological interpretation into initially interpreting this being as the pure objective presence of several subjects. It seems as if only negligible variations of the same kind of being lie before us, and yet ontologically there is an essential distinction between the indifferent being together of arbitrary things and the not mattering to one another of beings who are with one another. With regard to its positive modes, concern has two extreme possibilities. It can, so to speak, take the other's care away from him and put itself in his place in taking care. It can leap in for him. Concern takes over what is to be taken care of for the other. The other is thus displaced. He steps back so that afterwards, when the matter has been attended to, he can take it over as something finished and available or disburden himself of it completely. In this concern, the other can become someone who is dependent and dominated, even if this domination is a tacit one, and remains hidden from it. This kind of concern which does the job and takes away care is, to a large extent, determinative for being with one another and pertains, for the most part, to our taking care of things at hand. In contrast to this, there is the possibility of a concern which does not so much leap in for the other as leap ahead of him in his existential potentiality of being, not in order to take care away from him, but rather to authentically give it back as such. This concern which essentially pertains to authentic care, that is, it pertains to the existence of the other, and not to a what which it takes care of, helps the other to become transparent to himself in his care and free for it. Concern proves to be constitutive of the being of Dasein which, in accordance with its different possibilities, is bound up with its being toward the world taken care of, and also with its authentic being toward itself. Being with one another is based initially, and often exclusively, on what is taken care of together in such being. A being with one another which arises from one's doing the same thing as someone else not only keeps for the most part within outer limits, but enters the mode of distance and reserve. Being with one another of those who are employed for the same thing often thrives only on mistrust. On the other hand, when they devote themselves to the same thing in common, their doing so is determined by their Dasein, which has been moved. This authentic alliance first makes possible the proper kind of objectivity Satzlichkeit, which frees the other for himself in his freedom. Between the two extremes of positive concern, the one which does someone's job for him and dominates him, and the one which is in advance of him and frees him, everyday being with one another maintains itself, and shows many mixed forms whose description and classification lie outside of the limits of this investigation. Just as circumspection belongs to taking care of things as a way of discovering things at hand, concern is guided by considerateness and tolerance Nachsicht. With concern, both can go through the deficient and indifferent modes up to the point of inconsiderateness, and the tolerance which is guided by indifference Gleichgültigkeit. The world not only frees things at hand as beings encountered within the world, but also Dasein and others in their Dasein. But in accordance with its own meaning of being, this being which is freed in the surrounding world is being in the same world in which, as encounterable for others, it is there with them. Worldliness was interpreted, section 18, as the referential totality of significance. In being familiar with this significance and previously understanding it, Dasein lets things at hand be encountered as things discovered in their relevance. The referential context of significance is anchored in the being sane of Dasein toward its almost being. It cannot be relevance. It is rather being sane for the sake of which Warum Willen Dasein itself is as it is. But according to the analysis which we have now completed, Being with others mit anderen belongs to the being of Dasein, with which it is concerned in its very being. As being with Dasein is essentially for the sake of others. This must be understood as an existential statement as to its essence. But even when actual, factical Dasein does not turn to others and thinks that it does not need them, or misses them, it is in the mode of being with. In being with as the existential for the sake of others, these others are already disclosed in their Dasein. This previously constituted disclosedness of others together with being with thus helps to constitute significance, that is, worldliness. As this worldliness, disclosedness is anchored in the existential for the sake of it. Hence the worldliness of the world thus constituted in which Dasein always already essentially is, lets things at hand be encountered in the surrounding world in such a way that the Dasein-with of others is encountered at the same time with them, as circumspectly taken care of. The structure of the worldliness of the world is such that others are not initially present as unattached subjects along with other things, but show themselves in their heedful being in the surrounding world, in terms of the things at hand in that world. The disclosedness of the Dasein-with of others which belongs to being with means that the understanding of others already lies in the understanding of being of Dasein, because its being is being with. This understanding, like all understanding, is not a knowledge derived from cognition, but a primordially existential kind of being which first makes knowledge and cognition possible. Knowing oneself is grounded in being with, which primordially understands. It operates initially in accordance with the nearest kind of being together in Thureld Mitzienden in der Weltsein, in the understanding knowledge of what Dasein circumspectly finds and takes care of with other. Concernful taking care of things is understood in terms of what is taken care of, and with an understanding of. Thus the other is initially disclosed in the taking care of concern. But because concern, initially and for the most part, dwells in the deficient or at least indifferent modes, in the indifference of passing on another by the closest and essential knowing oneself, is in need of a getting to know oneself. And when even knowing oneself loses itself in aloofness, concealing oneself and misrepresenting oneself, being with one another requires special ways in order to get close to others or to see through them. But just as opening oneself up or closing oneself off are grounded in the actual mode of being with one another, indeed it is nothing besides this mode itself, so too does the explicit disclosure of the other in concern only grow out of one's primary being with it. Such a disclosure of the other, which is indeed thematic, but not in the mode of theoretical psychology, easily becomes the phenomenon that first comes into view for the theoretical problematic of understanding the psychical life of others. What initially presents phenomenally a way of being with one another that understands is at the same time, however, taken to mean that which, originally, and primordially makes possible and constitutes being toward others. This phenomenon, which is none too happily designated as empathy, is then supposed, as it were, to provide the first ontological bridge from one's own subject, initially given by itself, to the other subject, which is initially quite inaccessible. Be sure, being toward others is ontologically different from being toward objectively present things. The other being itself has the kind of being of Dasein. Thus, in being with and toward others, there is a relation of being from Dasein to Dasein. But one would like to say, this relation is after all already constitutive for one's own Dasein, which has an understanding of its own being, and is thus related to Dasein. The relation of being to others then becomes a projection of one's own being toward oneself into another. The other is a duplicate doubled of the self. But it is easy to see that this seemingly obvious deliberation has little ground to stand on. The presupposition which this argument makes use of, that the being of Dasein toward itself is a being toward another, is incorrect. As long as the presupposition has not been demonstrated clearly in its legitimacy, it remains puzzling how the relation of Dasein to itself should thus be disclosed to the other as other. Being toward others is not only an autonomous, irreducible relation of being, as being with it already exists with the being of Dasein. Of course, it is indisputable that a lively mutual acquaintanceship on the basis of being with often depends on how far one's own Dasein has actually understood itself. But this only means that it depends upon how far it has made one's essential being with others transparent and not disguised. This is possible only if Dasein as being in the world is always already with others. Empathy does not first constitute being with, but is first possible on its basis, and is motivated by the prevailing deficient modes of being with in their inevitability. But the fact that empathy is not an original existential phenomenon any more than is knowing in general, does not mean that there is no problem here. Its special hermeneutic will have to show how the various possibilities of being of Dasein themselves mislead and obstruct being with one another and its self-knowledge, so that a genuine understanding is suppressed and Dasein takes refuge in surrogates. This positive existential condition presupposes a correct understanding of the stranger for its possibility. Our analysis has shown that being with is an existential constituent of being in the world. Dasein-with has proved to be a manner of being which beings encountered within the world have as their own. That Dasein is it all, it has the kind of being with one another. Being with one another cannot be understood as an accumulative result of the occurrence of multiple subjects. Encountering a number of subjects itself is possible only by treating the others encountered in their Dasein-with merely as such numbers are discovered only by a distinctive being with and being toward one another. Inconsiderate being with reckons with others without seriously counting on them, or even wishing to have anything to do with them. One's own Dasein, like the Dasein-with of others, is encountered, initially and for the most part, in terms of the surrounding world taken care of, that is, shared mitwell. In being absorbed in the world of taking care of things, that is, at the same time in being with toward others, Dasein is not itself. Who is it, then, who has taken over being as everyday being with one another?